welcome back to another episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. This is the podcast for those wanting to navigate the secular world with faith-based values. Your support keeps this podcast going, so thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. I'll pass it right over to Travis to introduce our guest and the topic for today.
Thank you, Rigel, and thank you everyone for tuning in again to Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. Today, we are joined again by our friend Nicole. Nicole Scheidl is going to be talking with us today about how a woman balances her call to motherhood and building a career. So motherhood, a topic Rigel and I know absolutely nothing whatsoever about. And so we're bringing in someone who has a lot that she can share with us and a lot of wisdom that I'm sure our listeners will benefit from on the topic of balancing motherhood and career building as a woman. And so I'll give a little introduction here to Nicole. Nicole is a wife and a mother of 7 adult children. She studied science and commerce at the University of Saskatchewan before she completed a law degree at York University and a Master of Laws degree at Queen's University. She has practiced law. She has worked in the fields of sales and business development. She founded and operated Fit Minds, which is a Canadian non-pharmaceutical program to support brain health for seniors. And she currently serves as the executive director of Canadian Physicians for Life, which is committed to advancing life-affirming medical practice. So Nicole has obviously had an impressive career in a variety of different fields. And so she's going to be talking about that with us today, in addition to raising 7 little humans to adulthood, probably significantly more difficult than any of the career successes that she's had. But before we dive into the conversation, as we always do, I want to start us off with a passage or quote from someone to frame the conversation. And today's brief passage comes from Pope Francis, who has said, "A society without mothers would be a dehumanized society. For mothers are always, even in the worst moments, witnesses of tenderness, dedication, and moral strength. Dearest mothers, thank you for what you are in your family and for what you give to the church and to the world." So that comes from Pope Francis, highlighting the importance of mothers in our society. And our society entails work for most people, including many mothers. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today is finding a balance, hard as it seems like it probably is for many people, between the call to motherhood and building a career. So Nicole, thank you for joining us today. Maybe as a starting point, do you just want to walk us through briefly what your life has looked like, both from a motherhood perspective and from a career perspective? And then Rigel and I can jump in and ask you some questions.
Yeah, sure. That it almost feels a little daunting, but here we go. And it's not, Initially, I thought I wanted to study medicine. So I started out in sciences and then decided that I didn't have the compassion that a doctor should have. So I switched to law school. And I went to law school and met my husband just before I started law school. And we got married between second and third year. And he was in the Army. So we lived apart a lot for the first 9 years of our marriage. We actually only lived together for 4 of them and apart 9. So that was a challenge. And we didn't start having children until about 5 years of marriage. It actually was a gift from God that it was that long because he was in the first Gulf War. And so he was away for 6.5 months. We didn't know when he was coming home. And then when he came home, then we were blessed with our first child, a son. And so we had, I had 2 children while I was still practicing law. And that was really challenging. He was still away a lot during that time, and I was raising these 2 little kids and trying to practice law full time. And sometimes it was crazy. I remember one time he came home and he thought we'd been robbed because the house was such a mess. And we had not been robbed. I had just been on my own for a week with 2 little kids trying to survive and still work. In any event, we decided that it was time for a change. And so I decided to take a maternity leave with my 3rd, and that would be my swan song out of full-time practice. Then after that, I went back and did my master's in law, and we had during my master's, I had my fourth baby and got pregnant with my fifth and threw in there a little deployment to Bosnia for him. So life was always really exciting. And then after that, we moved to Toronto, and I had my sixth and seventh babies as I was teaching at a high school there, teaching law and philosophy. And then after that, we moved to Tampa because he was working there with Central Command headquarters, and I was able to start my dream of running my own business. And I had a small business down there doing marketing for other small businesses, and then moved up to Canada. And that's when we retired in Ottawa. And that was the end of having children. So we had 7 at that time, and they all went to school, and I settled into my career here and then started my own business, Fit Minds, which you alluded to, and then eventually sold that company or part of that company, and then came to work for the physicians.
Awesome, thank you. I know you've just had to cram a lifetime plus of stuff into a quick explanation. So apologies for the super open-ended question, but that's also an awesome segue into maybe diving in a little more deeply into what obviously would have been some challenges that came with filling your life with so much, including children, and then obviously building, not just building businesses, but making career changes, geographic changes, while doing it with a spouse who is oftentimes in danger on the other side of the world. So that is a lot for anybody, and you did all of it, which is amazing. Did you always feel called to motherhood? I presume because you were open to marriage, that motherhood was just something that you felt was probably going to come, but you also, aspiring to go to law school, probably had some career ambitions, presumably. What did that look like when you were a student and then making the decision to get married and start a career? What was that like, if you can walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So actually backing up to grade 12, because I think that's where it really started for me, was I decided I wanted to go to boarding school. My cousins had gone to boarding school. It sounded really cool. So I convinced my parents to send me to boarding school run by the Ursuline Sisters in a very small town in Saskatchewan. So I went there, and that year I tried to discern whether God was calling me to a religious vocation or to a marriage vocation. And it became very clear to me by the end of that year that God was calling me to a married vocation. And so that's actually something that I think is really important for people to discern, is what is God calling them to? And for women, if God is calling you to marriage, then I think you really need to start looking for the person that God is calling you to marry. Many women are told, oh, get your education first, get your career first, get all that settled, and then you'll find the guy that you're going to get married to. And by the time they do all that, they're well into their 30s, and it's way harder, way harder. So it was very clear to me that I was called to marriage. And so I started looking, or keeping my eye out, for my husband. And I actually met him on a blind date in Victoria. I flew out there at the behest of one of my friends to go to their graduation ball at the Royal Roads Military College, which is very fancy and like full dress, like a princess ball, right? So it's very easy to meet somebody there and fall in love. And I did. I fell in love with my husband that night. And we were conveniently going to be located in Toronto and Kingston at the end of the summer. So he would be going to Kingston to Royal Roads, or to Royal Military College, and I would be going to Osgoode Hall at York University for law school. So we were at least in the same province, and we could continue our dating and getting engaged and then finally getting married. So I didn't ever really think too much about it, except when it came to deciding where I would practice law, because I knew that getting married to him in the Army was going to mean we had to choose a place where it was likely that he would be posted regularly. And I had a dream of working in a big Toronto law firm, and I had to give up that dream because there was no way he was ever going to be posted to Toronto. So Kingston was the choice for us because of his profession, that was a likely posting place. And so that's where I ended up choosing to practice law. So that was kind of the first time that I had to decide or make a choice or give up something in order to make it work.
And before I turn it over to Rigel to ask a question, I for the benefit of our non-Catholic listeners, putting myself back what it was like years ago before I had even knew what a vocation was, because that is a uniquely Catholic thing to discuss. When Catholics talk about a vocation, generally there will be the distinction between the religious life and a life for lay people. So the religious life will be the priesthood, and then you'll have nuns and monks and stuff, people that commit themselves to a life in the Catholic tradition of celibacy and devotion to the church and service of the church and building God's kingdom. And we contrast that with the vocation, alternatively, to usually the married life, which is what, Nicole, you were talking about, which is the idea that you will find a spouse, and then in the sacrament of marriage, you will be open to life and to raising children. And so that is the idea of a vocation. And so, that's something that was unique to me when I learned about that, because growing up in a Protestant house, my father was a minister, and then he was also married and had children, and that is unique. So it was unique for me to learn about the Catholics, the Catholic worldview that goes back to the earliest days of Christianity on this distinction, and then trying to discern vocation. And so it's interesting to hear your story. When you were still a teenager, it sounds like you were thinking about whether or not you were being called to a religious life, which would have been a celibate life, or the life of a wife and then presumably a mother. And so it's interesting to think about that, because that's very foreign in our culture in general, I think, in the West. And then even for someone like me that grew up in a non-Catholic Christian household, that's a very foreign idea as well. So I appreciate you highlighting that part of your story. And I wanted to explain that for the benefit of our listeners who might not understand what vocation actually refers to. Rigel, do you want to ask a question of our guest?
Actually, could I just make a clarifying statement before Rigel gets in here? The whole point of vocation is, what's my path to holiness? What is going to help me become the best version of myself? Because the best version of myself is a really good person. And so for me, it was very clear that married life was the path that I needed to walk to become the best version of myself.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Nicole. A question I have, just because of the kind of culture that we live in today and the stuff that I see. You mentioned giving up your dream of working in a big Toronto law office to move to where you could be with your family. A lot of people would hear that and say, "Well, why should I be the one to give up my dream?" So even before we get to motherhood and your career, can you talk to us about what a healthy marriage looks like and how you came to that decision, the emotions you went through as you came to that decision? I think that'll help a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough decision to not be selfish, because we all think about ourselves and our own needs first. But to become really mature and to grow, we have to get out of ourselves and put the other person first. And in a healthy marriage, you each are doing that. You are each putting the other person first. So, for example, at the beginning of our marriage, naturally, not naturally, I guess, given our temperament and the way we both saw our careers, it made the most sense for us that the focus would be on my husband's career. And so we did that. And then when he retired, he said, "Now it's your turn." And he gave me complete support to start to do a startup. And you guys know how hard a startup is, and how there's no money coming in, and everything is by the shoestring and the bootstrap and whatever, right? Like you're just scraping it by. And, we had 7 kids and a mortgage and all of this stuff, but he gave me the space to do that and the support, which was incredible. So for me, it's a team effort, and you make decisions based on what's best for the two of you together. And I learned a ton and had so many experiences that I would have never had I not been willing to make that first sacrifice and give up that dream job, which in fact, my colleagues who went on to have that dream job in the end, I pitied them for the kind of life they led.
I'm glad that you said that. And the word pity, I think, is really unique because I have had a very similar experience coming from the world of finance. After I finished my MBA, I made a switch from the advertising industry into finance. I worked in portfolio management and then ultimately in private equity and venture capital. And in those industries, just as you'll have in the profession of law specifically, you'll get a lot of very intelligent people who are extremely hardworking and oftentimes extremely ambitious, which can lead to a lot of bad places as well, that combination of things. But you'll find a lot of people that also do awesome work, many of them doing it for the benefit of others. And that's incredible. Equally, though, Rigel and I have talked about this a lot too, specifically within the profession of finance. Generally, you will see a lot of people who achieve a whole bunch of things that our culture would say means they're successful, right? They have a bunch of letters after their name. They've got, big bonuses. They're climbing the corporate ladder, all that stuff. Things that I myself fell victim to, was striving after, was almost obsessively focused on for a period of time in my life. The more credentials I could get, the faster I would climb, et cetera, et cetera. And then ultimately, once you start doing it, at least for me, I found that not only was I not happy, I was finding the opposite. I was becoming miserable. I think I was miserable. And I'm not unique in that respect. I think I'm unique in that I was prepared to admit it and talk openly about it, potentially. I don't know why. Maybe by the grace of God, I got off a path I was on. But I think both Rigel and I can point to people that we know personally, that we've encountered professionally, who, looking at them now, they are quote unquote successful, and we pity them because their successes come at the expense of a lot of things that I bet if they could go back 5, 10, 15 years, they would not want. And now it's what they have. And so we pity them. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that in your story. A question that I have: giving up your one-time dream of working in a prestigious law firm in Toronto and stuff, did you, after making that decision to support your husband's career requirements, aspirations and stuff, did you ever have moments where you regretted it, struggled with it, or once the decision was made, was it something that you were pretty at peace with?
I don't think you ever make hard decisions without having moments of thinking, did I do the right thing? Or, wow, this is harder than I thought it would be. One thing that really helped me, though, was my faith life. So, for example, after we moved or decided to settle in Kingston and I was practicing law there, I really loved the law firm I worked at. I wanted to stay there forever. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to actually live with my husband. And I thought, I didn't get married to be a single mom, and something had to give. And so initially it was like, you know what? I'm making more money than him. He should give up his profession and find something else to do. And that was my mindset, which put our marriage, heading to a pretty big rock that we were going to founder on, I think, because of who he was and how integral being a Army officer was to how he saw himself and his sense of service and duty. It would have destroyed him as a human being. Giving up the practice of law would not have destroyed me as a human being. But I didn't see that until I really deepened my spiritual life. And then I heard God clearly say to me, actually, Nicole, you're the one who has to change. And so I remember agonizing over it for about a month. And I was thinking, okay, the best exit scenario for me is to have another baby, go on maternity leave, and don't come back. And I didn't think he would agree, because it would have cut our income in half. And that's a hard thing to do at any time. So I agonized about it for about a month, sat him down and said, okay, I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to say anything until I've told you everything. So I had all my arguments and I went through my spiel, like this argument and that argument. And then he just looked at me and he said, I'm so glad you feel that way. I always thought one of us should stay at home with the kids, but I knew I couldn't do it and I didn't want to pressure you into doing it. And then honestly, I just wanted to slug him, because I had had so much anxiety and angst over this decision, and he was already there. And if I just sort of talked to him about it in a more natural way, we would have come to that conclusion much sooner with way less grief on my part. But, anyways, you live and learn. So I think it was, it's always a process, and you're always growing, and you're always looking at what's best for you both to help you both grow. And I think that's a continuing conversation you have your entire lives.
Nicole, I have to ask because, the one resource in life that's finite is time. And you seem to have excelled in all the aspects of life that seem to demand the most time. So professionally, you've excelled, and not only excelled, but you've actually started a company, which is probably the most time consuming profession. And not only did you have kids, you had 7 kids. So you've gone to the extreme for both things. Did you always plan to have 7 kids, or is it something that just kind of happened? And please talk to us about the challenges that came with dealing with all of that.
Yeah, so I came from a family of 4 children, and my husband came from a family of 2. So anything more than 2 was completely foreign to him. But I thought, oh, I'd really like 4. So I said, let's have 6. So I thought we'd negotiate down to 4. But part of it became just being open to God and having things happen. And honestly, many of our children are associated with world events, right? So I have a Bosnia baby, I have a ice storm baby, I have a Ethiopia, Eritrea baby. There's something with those kinds of things happening in the world that I think bring life into the world too. So part of it was being open. And as I got older, it was easier because of experience to say, you know what, God, I'm going to trust you a little bit more and not try to manage everything myself. And things happen. Life sometimes doesn't work out the way you think. But when I look back at all the hard things that happened in my life, I always think, wow, I'm so glad they happened because they put me into a different trajectory. They changed the direction I was going in. And the direction that it took me in is way better than anything I could have imagined. And so sometimes that trust in God is allowing Him to be creative in your life and give you a life that you never expected, but that is way better than anything you could have ever dreamed.
I like what you explained there, Nicole, about trusting God and being open effectively open to His will for your life with respect to the number of children. And that's a very difficult thing especially in our secular Western consumeristic world where we want to set the terms as we want them. No one can tell us what. We're radically individualistic. We all know that. Even people that don't think about these things, I think they intuitively realize that their lives are very individualistic relative to how previous Canadians would have lived, even certainly other societies around the world. I'm very aware of this because my wife is not from Canada. I've married a refugee immigrant who comes from a society that is far more communal. It's changing, unfortunately, and it's sad to see it changing. But that has made me so aware of how individualistic we are here and how that leads us in many ways to feel like we can control way more than we can actually control in our lives. And it's understandable because accepting that so little is actually in our control is a very scary thing. For anybody, I think that's a very scary thing. People couldn't get out of bed in the morning and go on with their lives if they realized how little they can actually control in their lives. But if you can accept that, I think it gets you to a place where we should all strive to be as Christians, where we're open to God's will, whatever that means and wherever that leads. And I want to make a book recommendation for people who are either married or planning to become married or are talking about children. It was a book that was given to my wife and I a couple months ago from Kimberly Hahn. She is the wife of Scott Hahn, who Catholic listeners will know these people. And the book is called Life-Giving Love. And our friends Israel and Heidi gave it to us. I read it in December. And what really struck me about the book was the openness to God's will for your life, including the inclusion of children and how many that might be. And I believe they have 5 children, which is, they've got nothing on you with 7, but the acceptance of God's will. And it's almost like when you can get there, it leads to a place of peace, despite, how many children might be coming. If you can just accept that it's God's will for your life, I think that would probably allow you to live in a more peaceful manner than if you were trying to control all of those things, which are fundamentally usually beyond your control. Maybe if you can speak to what that looks like, because I know for a lot of young women, I think about this with my wife, who's younger than me and is finishing a university degree and doesn't know if she's motivated to pursue a career or something, but she feels called to motherhood if that's where we're called to. But this is something she would wrestle with. Nicole, maybe if you can speak to what advice you would have for young women who are either pursuing education or early in their careers about being open to motherhood, including potentially being a mother multiple times over.
When you get to the end of your life, the thing that's going to matter most to you are the people in it. When I was practicing law, I was closing hundreds of real estate deals a year. At the end of my life, that's not going to even be part of the thing that I list as the things that I'm proud of or that make a difference to me. But those 7 children standing around my bed as I die will be a legacy that I'll be incredibly proud of, that will actually have an impact for hundreds of years because they'll have children. And the way I brought them up and the principles and the love that I showed them is going to have an impact on them and what they do with their children. So I think if you're thinking about, I want impact in my life, I want to make a difference, frankly, having children is the most powerful way to do that because it will last much longer than any company, any impact you had on any company, anything that you did professionally. So that's one thing. I think the other thing for women to think about is most of us do not stay in working for one company anymore our entire life. That's just not the trajectory of most people's career. There's a lot of change, there's a lot of pivoting, there's a lot of doing something different. And that can easily allow motherhood to grow alongside your career. And maybe your career goes a little slower, but I would say being a mother teaches you so much personally, gives you so much more sensitivity to other people that allows you to be a better lawyer, banker, financer, doctor, whatever you are. It actually impacts your career so much more positively because you have that experience. So I wouldn't say to anyone that it's a detriment to be a mother. It's an asset. The other thing I would say is I've had babies in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it's definitely easier to have them in your 20s. So I would have my babies. If I had to do it again, I would have them. I mean, some of it is you can't control, but to try and do it as early as possible because, first of all, you have a lot more energy for when they need you physically, and you get to enjoy so much more of their growing up, young adulthood, and God willing, grandparenthood, because you have more years to devote to that.
I'll make one comment and then Rigel, I'll turn it over to you for a question. But on that topic, Nicole, to reference the book that I mentioned from Kimberly Hahn called Life Giving Love, she interviews hundreds, maybe it was thousands of people, not for the book, but throughout the period leading up to the book. And she made a comment in the book that really struck me, which was effectively that she has met not a single woman who, towards the end of her life, wished she'd had fewer children, but she'd met hundreds of women or more who wished they'd had more. And that's pretty lopsided. That's a pretty, 0 to hundreds that's conclusive. And so I think that really struck me, and it ties to what your next comment was, Nicole, about the age, because I'm middle-aged. I'm about to be 40. My wife is a lot younger than me, and there are biological realities around parenthood and everything. And so I think, despite the fact that our culture tells us, get an education, build your career, and then think about doing these other things. I think if we're to trust what Kimberly Hahn has said, a lot of people do those things and then they can't have the number of children they wanted. And that's what they regret later in life. And they won't think about, to your point, they won't think about the real estate deals. If you're like Rigel and I, we won't think about the tech startups we invested in or advised or the transactions we closed. Those aren't the things we're going to think about. And I think we need to be real about that while we can still do something about it with the time God has given us. Anyways, Rigel, over to you for a question.
Could I make one more comment on that before? Sorry. One other thing that is interesting is when you get married young, you build your life together. So when I was getting married, I was still in law school, and all my classmates were saying, "Are you going to have a prenup, an agreement before you get married?" It's like, for what? All I have is debts. It's not like there's anything to divide. And so when we started, we had cardboard furniture. We borrowed a camper mattress from our neighbors. We had little cardboard boxes for end tables. We built a dining room table out of cardboard boxes, put a tablecloth over it, and had some camper chairs. Like, we had nothing when we started. So everything we've done together. And that kind of richness in our married life is incredible. And I think people cheat themselves of that if they try to build everything themselves and then look for someone to share that with instead of building it together.
I think you're dead on, Nicole. Thanks for sharing that. For me personally, I've done all the mental gymnastics, being like, I'll have 2 kids because that's financially viable. It makes sense. The world is super expensive. I don't know how much money I'm going to make. I don't know how much money my wife is going to make, and so 2 kids, that's reasonable because my parents had 2 kids. So it seems like a decent number. But as I've grown in the faith, and I'm just surrendering more to the will of God. I'm just thinking that, like, and even when I think about what it takes for me to be happy, I think having a large family is what I want. Because exactly like you said, and exactly like Travis said, I've heard of so many people who have said that they wish they had spent more time with their kids. They wish they had a bigger family. And never have I heard anyone say, "Oh, I wish I had spent more time in the office and less time with my kids at home." Never has anyone said that. So knowing that, and applying a long-term mindset, it just seems obvious that the thing we should be optimizing for is the thing that will make us happiest at the end of our lives, which would be family and kids, and of course God. But the challenges are very real, and like Travis said, it's not easy to surrender to the will of God. So can you, and this is a kind of a selfish question for me, because I want to understand, if I am committed to having a big family, I want to understand the challenges that are involved. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit about the challenges, starting with, kid number 1, and how those challenges evolved over time as, you and your husband got older, but there were more kids around, but maybe there were also older kids around that could help take care of some of the other kids. These are some of the things that I'm thinking about, but I don't know the realities of it.
Those are really great questions. So, first baby, you're learning everything. You know nothing. And so it's really challenging even to figure things out together. When I was pregnant with our second, my husband was like, "I'm not sure if I can love this second baby as much as I love the first baby," because I love the first guy quite a bit. And so he was really concerned about that. But then our second was born, and of course, your heart expands and your capacity to love grows. So, one thing about having a large family is you're focused on people rather than things. You have to be, because there's just a lot more people in your life. And so that makes you open to others and actually allows you to have a rich social life, because anyone can come into your home. There's room for everyone. And that's a great kind of framework and outlook to have. Then, when your third baby comes along, that's when you really grow as a parent, because all of a sudden there's more of them than you. If you're alone, there's more of them than you have hands. So you really have to develop parenting strategies that you might not have had to develop with 1 or 2. The other interesting thing that happens is the oldest 2 in particular generally start to set the tone for the family, for the siblings. And siblings know far more than you do as a parent what's going on in the lives of their brothers and sisters. And the oldest two, sometimes they act as policemen, sometimes they act as enforcers, but they have a very good sense of kind of what the family dynamic is, what the framework within which the family operates, and they enforce it. And so I would say, actually, once you get over that third child, it doesn't make any difference in terms of uh, challenges. I mean, each kid has their own personalities, and those can be challenging. But in terms of parenting, you've by then you have all the skills and you're up the learning curve, and then it gets fun, because up until then, half the time you have no clue what you're doing, and it can be very stressful. But when your fourth comes along and is throwing a temper tantrum, you kind of look at them and say, well, your sister did it better, so you're going to have to try harder if you're going to impress me, right? So you have a lot more skills as a parent than you would have had with 1, 2, and even 3. So that makes parenting much more enjoyable. And if you've really focused on making sure you've given the values and the kind of framework that you want to the first two, that really makes a huge difference on how the rest of the family unfolds, because they really have a big impact on their siblings. I can remember once one of the youngest got into trouble over something. I can't even remember what it was. But the oldest said to me, aren't you going to do something about this? And I said, well, all of you are jumping on her. I don't have to do anything. She's been totally parented. It's like, I can just sit back and let things unfold. So I think having a lot of children, especially if you foster family bonds, it can be so incredibly rewarding.
That's an awesome story, and I'll share. I've shared the story before, but it's to the point of our friends. They've got 4 young children, 2, 4, 5, and 6 years old, and the 6-year-old is super active in our church. And when the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old and the 5-year-old, when we're at mass and we should be reverent, we should be focused, and we should be praying, they might be dancing, they might be, bouncing off the desks. But the 6-year-old knows exactly what she ought to be doing, and she helps her parents discipline the 2, 4, and 5-year-old. And it is a truly beautiful thing to see. It is among the most beautiful things I can actually think about personally witnessing in my life, to see the 6-year-old helping her parents already to further educate and form her younger siblings in the faith. And to your point, Nicole, she probably knows her siblings better than her parents do in many respects. And it's a really beautiful thing to say. And she's only 6. And so, I think that touches on, like the kids doggy piling on the youngest. They've already done the parenting for you, because you've taught them, and they can help parent the younger siblings, which is amazing. I think what Rigel was touching on, and this has been a struggle for me too, for a long time, including, and I won't go into the details, but the chance for me to even come into the Catholic Church, because I was previously married and that marriage ended in divorce. And so I'm petitioning for an annulment of that first marriage on the grounds that marriage could never have been valid, for several reasons, but for the simple reason that we were not open to life. Categorically ruled it out. And that has been an interesting and profound thing for me to come to realize, is how much control I was trying to exercise over my life in my pride and whatever it might be. And so that fact even gives me a chance now to come into the Catholic Church, because we believe that my first marriage wasn't really a marriage, because we fundamentally cut off a huge part of what the sacrament of marriage actually is, which is openness to life. And I think what that speaks to is our need in our culture for control and wanting to control things, because, to Rigel's comment, life is scary, expensive. And it feels incredibly expensive. And we hear the horror stories of how expensive raising children is. And so I know Rigel and I have talked about this a lot. Nicole, what advice can you share, maybe purely from a financial perspective, having been a parent, raising children in a country that isn't cheap? Canada is not a cheap country to raise a family in. What learnings can you share with young mothers and or fathers who are struggling financially with being open to having a big family?
I'm not going to say that financial worries aren't important, because they are, and we all struggle with them. But children don't have to be as expensive as people think they are. Most of my children had hand me down clothes, or clothes. Vintage shopping was a big thing, right? Like go to Value Village or Mission Thrift or whatever. And also, when you have a big family, people realize that you could use clothes. And so many times people will come over with a bag of clothes and drop it on the front step, and here you go. So clothing honestly was never a problem. My kids always had sufficient clothing, sufficiently fashionable. It was fine. Food, yes, that's an expense, but you can shop wisely, home cook meals, teach them how to cook. You can live fairly simply. Where it gets expensive is depending what kind of sports you want your children in, what kind of other activities you want them to do. I think those things are really valuable for children. But I grew up in a family that was very devoted to um, high levels of competitive sports. So I was a national level synchronized swimmer. My brothers and sisters did speed swimming and played basketball at the university levels. They were very, very good athletes. So we spent a lot of time in athletics, not a lot of time sitting around the dinner table together. And when we started having our family, we decided we didn't want to do that. We wanted to sit around the dining room table more than the sports. So our children did do sports. They all have their own sport that they love, and that's great. But something that was really important to me, and that I would say was the best thing I ever did, was we tried to eat dinner tonight every night together as a family. Lots of families don't do that. I think that has a huge impact on your family life and on the way your children see the world, because you can speak about the things that are happening in the world and give them a framework within which to look at them and understand them. You can pass on your values. You can teach them how to have good social manners, because they learn how to carry on a conversation, how to listen to others. So the things that you teach them around the dining room table are really important. So I don't think it costs as much money to have kids as we think it does, but we're often concerned that we won't be able to give them enough and that somehow we'll fail them. But the things that matter most is that we believe in them as human beings and encourage them to become the best version of themselves. We had one time in our lives when my husband left the army, and then he didn't have work right away. The work he had fell through, so we were without an income, and it was very scary, and so everyone had to stop their sports. We could do nothing extra. And that September was the best September we ever had, because we had to be together as a family. We had to rely on each other. We spent time together, and it was so great. So I think sometimes we oversell what sports and other endeavors do for our family, and they can often sometimes take us away from our family instead of bringing us together. And so each thing that you look at, you have to look at, does it help people become better? Is it good for them, and is it good for the family? And those kinds of discussions can really help you determine what's best for building the kind of family that you want to build.
That's awesome, Nicole. This is actually really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for our audience as well. It's funny, as I was getting to my own conclusion that I want a big family. Like it would be great to have like 5 or 6 kids. We went on our trip to India, and just by happenstance, we talked to like 4 or 5 people who all came up to us and were like, just surrender to the will of God. Don't set a cap on yourselves that we're going to have 2 or 3 kids. You can't be closed off to kids, and God is going to give you how many ever, and you have to be willing to accept that. And so we have to think through the realities of that. And as I've been thinking through it, it's just like one of the things that we do is put pressure on ourselves for the kind of life that we want our kids to have. And we say, it's going to be expensive because, like you said, we have to put them through sports and extracurriculars, and we have to pay for college and, all this other stuff. But realistically, what kids really need for a rich life is you, God, the values that you instill in them and the independence to chase after their dreams. They don't necessarily need you to put them into extracurriculars. Like if you teach them correctly, they will figure that stuff out. And the way the world is going, they might not even go to college. It might not be a valid thing anymore. So, there's a lot of stuff that we put pressure on ourselves for in terms of the life that we want to give our kids. And that actually limits the amount of kids that we're willing to have because it's impossible to afford, um, you know, all those things for 7 children, for example. I want to chat a little bit about your journey in entrepreneurship as well, because, like you said, Travis and I have invested in tech startups, and we follow the ecosystem, and we hear entrepreneurs saying all the time how difficult it is and how time consuming it is. It's impossible workload, and entrepreneurs need a mental health break as well. Now, I kind of want to say to them, try exiting a business and raising 7 kids and being present for them while your husband's not even there a lot of the time. Like that just seems impossible. So can you talk through how you were able to manage all of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, it didn't all happen at once. So with the business, one of the things that actually turned out to be such a blessing, I've had a couple of partners come and go, but one of the individuals that started working with us at the beginning and has stayed has been my oldest daughter. And I wouldn't recommend necessarily working with your children because can be very challenging. And I wouldn't actually work with any of my children except for her, just because our personalities mesh in a certain way that really works well. In fact, when Invest Ottawa did they did a kind of a temperament analysis of your executive suite, and they plotted on a graph, and she and I are exactly opposite. So my strengths are her weaknesses, and my weaknesses are her strengths. So we actually work together really well. And that has been such a blessing because, really when we started out and she was working for us and she wasn't getting paid because we had no money, but she could live at home and I could feed her. And you can't really do that someone who's not a member of the family. So that allowed us to get started with a kind of a minimal capital outlay and have her on board. And so we've built the business together, and that's been such a gift as we've gone along. So I would say one of the things that was really useful for us when we were starting the business was actually a program that Invest Ottawa had that was really focused on helping entrepreneurs make sure they had a minimum viable product. Like, do you have something that the market's really going to take an interest in or not? Because you can spend a lot of time and a lot of energy on something that you really think is cool, but you're never going to be able to sell it. And that's the reality. You have to be able to make money with your product. Otherwise, it's a great hobby. And you shouldn't destroy your family over a great hobby. And so I think that's something that people have to be able to get good advice on and really see whether their idea has legs or not and what that's going to look like.
I want to highlight a recent experience that I had on a very similar topic, Nicole. I teach an undergraduate class in business plan development at a local university here in Calgary. And the students have to basically create a startup. Not a real one, but they go through the process of coming up with a business idea, building a plan around it. And then on the last days of class, they have to get in front of me and a panel of real investors that I've put together. And they basically have to ask them for $1 million is the nature of the class. And it's a cool experience. I think they're finding it valuable. And a couple of weeks ago, I brought in some guest speakers, including the co-founders of a Calgary-based startup company that has done exceptionally well. I'm an investor in the company. I invested about 4 years ago. They've just raised their latest round of financing, about $7 million, and they're doing really well. But that's not the story. The story is that one of the co-founders, her name is Jen, she started this company and then shortly thereafter found out she was pregnant with her first child. And so when she came in and talked to the class, I didn't ask her to do this. She just started talking about building a business that was growing faster than she anticipated, required way more time than she anticipated. And she's also had 3 children and raised those children during that process. And she just started talking about that without me prompting her to. And that's exactly what I would have wanted her to talk about, because I feel as though that's important for us to make, especially women, aware of the fact that you can be a mother and you can, if you desire it, if you feel called to it, also pursue maybe entrepreneurship or maybe a specific career path or whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be an either or scenario. And I think the common narrative in our culture is it is either or, and you will suffer in your career. So you ought to focus only on that, and motherhood comes either never or later. And I think that's tragic for so many reasons. I'm sure I'm not the only person that feels that way. Has that been your experience, Nicole, either talking to your own daughters about their own lives or other people, that we need to help young women who feel called to motherhood realize that the trade-off between career and motherhood doesn't have to be so stark as it seems like our culture tells us it is?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Travis. So I started work before computers and email. That tells you how old I am. And I remember when we had that introduction of computers into the practice of law, and we weren't even allowed to email outside of the law office. We could only email inside the law office. That was the first way that I experienced email. And that kind of work structure was you had to be in the office, you had to be there from like 7, 8 a.m. until 5 or 6 p.m. at night. It was very rigid. I think computers and technology has changed that for a lot of people. I mean, the company that I started is run out of a computer, so we can do it anywhere. Like my daughter and I can be traveling, and we can still be running our company. It's not outside the realm of possibility. And I think technology has opened that up for women, that they can work from home. And even the pandemic forced people home and changed the nature of work. So I think hybrid work is here to stay. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we have to find a way to make sure we're still productive, but that it allows us to take care of our families. And that's a good thing. I would say the best work environment I ever had was when I had my 6th child. I was going to start teaching at a high school in Toronto. I had taken the job before I was pregnant, then found out I was pregnant, and I really needed to work because I was coming back to work after being off work for a while. We wanted our children to go to these independent schools because of where we were living. It was not really practical for them to go to the local schools. So I had to make money to pay for their schooling. And so I needed to work. So I asked my doctor if I could be induced on a Friday because it would be really much more convenient for me to have the baby on the weekend. And my husband was in school at staff college, and it would be more convenient for him to show up to have it for the baby on the weekend. So she thought that was reasonable. So we went in and had the baby. I mean, I was a week overdue, so it's not like it was medically dangerous or anything. So we had Joseph, my number 6, on the weekend, and I was back at work on Monday with him in tow. And the school was really great, and they had a nursery on site, and he could go into the nursery, and I could go get him when I needed him, or he could sit in my office. And they were very flexible for that first term, giving me a reduced workload, but also making sure that I could still take care of my family as well as take care of the things that I needed to do at the school. And that is such a great witness to everyone. It was a girls' school, so it was a great witness to the girls that you can combine work and family. And it's funny because that was in 2001, and I actually started teaching there again this year, teaching law. And there's still the rumor or the story of me coming back to school with my baby is still there. I don't know, it's like 20 years later, they're still talking about it. So it's funny. But I think there's lots that the workplace can do to integrate family concerns and family responsibilities into the way they support the staff that works in different situations. For women, being an entrepreneur oftentimes gives you so much flexibility. It's great. but it does take a lot of time, right? Like it's not an easy thing to start a business.
Nicole, there's a few things that I'm noticing in your story, and there's because I know other women who are in kind of a similar position where they really do want to balance a career and their family life. First thing is that you competed in sports at a high level, and I recognize that as a trend that kids who do that and continue to compete in athletics, they're much more empowered, much more confident, right? And so they feel like anything they set their minds to, they can do. It seems like you have that. At the same time, there've also been instances like with Joseph, as you mentioned, where either your employer or someone that you might be beholden to has been supportive of your decision, and that just strikes me as sometimes we just have to ask for help, and I think we forget to do that a lot of the time. And this is just an example to me of how God really does want things to work out for us, but we have to be willing to ask. We have to be open to things, and he'll fix our circumstances as we need them to be fixed, right? And things will work out just fine. We just have to have that faith ahead of time.
Yeah, I just want to actually circle back to a comment or a thought I had about post secondary education and high level sports. So, one of my daughters competes equestrian, so horseback riding, not a cheap sport by any stretch of the imagination. So, when we were down in Florida, horseback riding lessons were like piano lessons, they were really reasonable. But when we came back to Canada, they weren't. And at a certain point, we said to her, like, we just can't afford this anymore. So the barn said, we really like her. We'll let her work for her lessons. And so she started working for her lessons at the age of 14. So she's 24 now. For 10 years, she's paid for her own horse. For all of our children, we had a little bit of money put aside to help them at the beginning of their post secondary, pay for about half the tuition of their first post secondary year. But after that, they were on their own. And most of them have gone through their post-secondary education and paid for it themselves. And for me, when watching them do that, first of all, they took their studies seriously. They actually went to school because they were paying for it. They studied because they were paying for it. And they took things that they knew were going to be useful to them because they were paying for it. So they were investing in themselves and they treated it like an investment in themselves. So even though you want your children to have these things because it's good for them, it's also really good for them to be responsible for some of the investment. And you do what you can, but at the end of the day, you can't do everything for them. And I don't think you should, because I think that then creates in them a sense of entitlement and expectation that everything's going to be handed to them. And that is not going to help them through their lives or help them be the kind of people that can be resilient to when things go wrong. So when challenges come up, and all of us face challenges in our life, if you haven't built up that personal resilience, you will just crumble and you will not be able to face the things that life throws at you. But if over time with your parents don't do everything for you and they help you and encourage you, but you're responsible for taking on some of these responsibilities, that is actually such a gift to your children.
I'm glad that you said that, Nicole. And it's a topic actually that Rigel and I have talked about many times. I think, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of stuff on social media about problems with millennials specifically. And we have to be careful about generalizations and everything. And now we have the generation after millennials, and there's all sorts of stuff being said about them. But a lot of the stuff I think is pretty accurate, and it speaks to the point that you're making about you do your children or anyone else, but you do your children no favors if they are too coddled or almost too provided for, because especially the world of work, like when you go to the world of work, people don't just hand you things just because, and there are expectations. And I see this a lot as a teacher. It's amazing, Nicole, your comment about your children paying their way through school. It's an investment. They appreciate it more. They probably learn more because they know why it's valuable. I can't tell you how frustrating it is for me as a teacher to see classrooms that probably half the students they don't care to be there. On Monday of last week, it was beautiful weather. Weather wasn't an excuse. Only 40% of the class showed up. The final project's due in like a week and a half, guys. Like, you should be there. But the people that weren't showing up are the ones that haven't been showing up throughout. And I would guess that there's probably a strong correlation between those who are paying their way through school and are showing up, and the opposite, the ones that it's being gifted or whatever. And I think that those students, if they're being coddled too much, they will get a job after university, presumably, and there will be a rough adjustment for them, and that's sad, because as someone who employs young people or whatever, I know that my standards in the workplace are higher than they are in the universities, because I can't do anything in the university, but I can do something about it as their manager in the workplace, where I control their income or not. So anyways, I appreciate you highlighting that, because this is something that Rigel and I have chatted about before. I think that's probably all the time that we have for today. Nicole, really want to thank you for coming on here. There's a lot that I've learned about for myself that I think, God willing, one day my wife and I are called to be parents that I will be referring back to. I know, Rigel, probably the same for you, God willing. In the future, parenthood is a thing that you and your wife are navigating, and I'm sure that there's a lot that Nicole has shared with us that is of value to our listeners. Rigel, do you want to finish with anything and then lead us in a prayer?
Sure. Just a few personal takeaways for me. I think a lot of the time people consider kids as kind of a component that takes something away from your lives. But I think really they add to your lives. They increase your capacity for things. And so that's one thing that's definitely a takeaway for me. Another is that if you want to do everything, I think everything is possible. And Nicole is a living testament to that. Like, you don't necessarily have to sacrifice your dreams. Like, yes, you might have to sacrifice them at one point, and you may not achieve everything at the time that you want to achieve it. But at the end of the day, it seems like, if you set your mind to it, and, you have that faith, and you put God at the center of your life, then everything that you want to achieve is possible. And I think that's a great takeaway for me, and hopefully for our audience as well. Everyone wants a rich life. They want rich lives for their kids. And all of it is possible with God. Travis, anything else before we finish up?
Nothing other than just to say that I also want to mention that Nicole probably comes across as a superhero to a lot of people because of the sheer amount of stuff that she's been able to fill her life with. And so that's awesome. I also want to point out that there are a lot of people that don't feel called to pursue a career and feel called to pursue motherhood alone. And so our conversation today isn't remotely to diminish the value of women who feel the call purely to motherhood. So I want to make sure that we say that. Today's conversation was focused largely on the reality that in our culture, in Canada and other parts of the Western world, we diminish motherhood and the value of motherhood at the expense or deferring to career. And I think Nicole is an amazing testament to the fact that not just mothers, but Christian mothers specifically, don't necessarily have to buy into what our culture tells us, that you can still prioritize motherhood, be open to God's will for your life in all respects, including raising children, and still pursue a career. And it can even be complementary. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that it hinders you. It can actually be beneficial. And I think Nicole has shared a lot today that will be really helpful for people in that respect. So no, thank you again, Nicole, for joining us and sharing that. Any parting words that you have for us, Nicole, before Rigel wraps us up with prayer?
Just on the point of motherhood and maybe motherhood full-time, motherhood full-time is still as demanding as professional work, or paid professional work, let's put it that way, because motherhood is something that demands everything from you. You still need to have formation. You still need to read. You still need to figure things out. You're running a house, which is like running a small business, actually. So I don't think anyone should denigrate that. I think it's a wonderful part of being a woman, is the capacity to be a mother and to choose to stay at home and take care of your children full time. There were times in my life when I did that, and it was fantastic. I remember when I was going back to work and I was saying to my husband, I'm not sure I'm going to like this. Because it's going to be such a change, and it was such a positive experience for us when I was able to stay at home full time. Sometimes life doesn't allow you to do that. If it does allow you to do that, it's a great gift and you should cherish it.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicole. We'll go ahead and wrap up with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we pray for mothers all around the world. We pray that you instill them with the faith that is necessary to have children, the faith that you will provide for us, even in the direst of circumstances, and we need not worry. We pray for Nicole and her family. Bless them all and bring them ever closer to you. Help them to grow in faith and love for you and for each other. We also pray especially for parents who are struggling. We ask that you stand by their side and comfort them as they face the challenges that life presents. We pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This has been another episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. If you have any feedback, please email it to coffcomcat@gmail.com. All the information, any resources will be posted in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in, and tune in again next week for our next episode. God bless.